We are now live on the YouTube stream.
They don't know what it is. Oh, that's amazing. Oh.
Don't tell them. Don't tell them. It's so dumb.
It's JJ.
We're here.
JJ, do you know the list of people who are supposed to attend?
I can pull it up. You see who's in the waiting room, right?
Yeah. Are these all of the participants?
No, we have a bunch more. I don't know where everyone is.
How many are we missing?
Let me check. Yeah, we had 20 responses in the sign up.
Yes, and let's see. So we're waiting for 4 more. Right?
I believe so. You want to start recording the Zoom channel?
What's that?
I'm going to start recording the Zoom call.
I thought JJ or Jay was.
He's live.
Oh yeah, you can start recording it. Yeah.
This meeting is being recorded.
One more minute. Okay, 9:05. Would you like me to let them in?
Hey, Brent. Hello, beautiful people.
Hello, everyone. We're just going to be waiting for another 5 minutes just for anybody else who's going to jump onto the call. And then we'll get started at 8:10 Central Time or 9:10 EST.
Awesome.
All right, I have 810. Welcome everybody to the Black Lives Matter Roundtable hosted by Mafa. My name is Cedric Antonio and I'm the current president of the Midwest Association of Filipino Americans. And I'm really glad that you guys were able to join us tonight. And we're really looking forward to hearing your perspective about Black Lives Matter and just the things that you've been experiencing lately. So in terms of our agenda today, we're going to start off with some welcome and introductions, and then we'll go into a community wellness check. Then we'll talk about dismantling anti-blackness and racism. And then we'll talk about how to have conversations with family and friends. And lastly, we'll talk about how to be an ally for Black Lives Matter. So welcome. We are Mafa, and we were established in 2008, and we now have over 28 member schools. And I know many of you on the call kind of represent different portions of the Midwest. So we're really excited to see everybody today. So in terms of introductions, since this is going to be discussion based, we wanted people to be able to introduce themselves and get to know each other and be really open and feel free to talk. So just to set some ground rules for our discussions today and the topics that we're talking about, just please listen respectfully to each person, keep an open mind as to what everyone is saying, and be intentional. And what being intentional means is when you say something, just make sure that you're thinking about the potential effects of what you're saying and how others might perceive it. So just make sure you're being careful with wording and things like that. So I'm going to open it up after I'm done with the slides for each of you to introduce yourself. I'd like for each of you to just tell us your name and tell us what university you attend and what associated or affiliated organization you're a part of. And if you'd like to add, you can also add what pronouns you prefer to use. And while everyone's introducing themselves to everybody, in the back of your mind, please just think about our first discussion question, which is, what is one great thing that has happened to you recently, or how have you been feeling this week? Great. So if you'd like to speak first, or whenever you want to speak during these discussions, you'll kind of see this symbol and it kind of represents that it's going to be a discussion for this slide. Please use the react symbols or the react capability within Zoom to raise your hand so that I can unmute you and you can talk. So I'll start out by introducing myself again. So my name is Cedric Antonio. I am a student at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and my pronouns are he, him, and his. Does anybody else want to go next? All right, I guess JJ is going to kick us off.
Hey everybody, my name is Sergio, but I prefer JJ. My pronouns are he, his, him. I go to the University of Michigan Dearborn, SAFA, and I'm the outreach chair for Mafa.
Sweet. Let's have Alex next.
What's good, y'all? My name is Alex Diebold. My pronouns are he, him, his, from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, FASO, and I'm Mafa's Vice President Internal. Happy to see y'all here.
Thanks, Alex. Angeline.
Hi, I'm Jolene. I go to Chamberlain University, but I represent FASU, the Filipino American Students of Open University, and I am their cultural chair, and my pronouns are she and her.
Rachel, you're next.
Hi, you guys. I'm the eldest one here. I went to school in California, UC Davis, and now I am in Indiana, and I was invited by JJ.
Thanks, Rachel. Jason, would you like to go next?
Hello, everyone. My name is Jason Wright. I go to the University of Michigan Dearborn. I'm part of SAFA with JJ. And my personal pronouns are he, him, his.
Thanks, Jason. Amy.
Hey everyone, my name is Amy. I graduated from Wayne State University and I was part of PhilSoc, and my pronouns are she, her, hers.
Marielle.
Hi everyone, I'm Marielle. My preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm a student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm part of VASO, and I'm Mafa's treasurer.
Thanks, Marielle. Rafi.
Hi everyone, I'm Rafi. I'm an alumna of University of Wisconsin-Madison and FASO. I'm also an alumna of Mafa's executive board, and now I am affiliated with Kabataan Alliance, which is a national organization for youth and students, Filipino youth and students across the country. And I was invited by Mafa.
Thanks, Rafi. Jay.
Hi everyone, I'm James Miller. I go by Jay, he, him, his pronouns. I'm a recent graduate of MyEd up here in Wisconsin, but I'm affiliated with the Filipino Student Union of the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. And I'm also the new incoming Director of Media for 2021.
Thanks, Jay. Kavante.
Hi, everyone. I'm Cavante. Pronouns are he, him, his. I'm affiliated with both PhilSoc and Capamelia at Eastern Michigan University. That's all.
Thanks, Kavante. Anna.
Hi, I'm Anna Marie. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I currently go to Illinois State University, and I represent APAC, which is the Asian Pacific American Coalition. Thank you.
Maddie.
Is it working now? Okay. Hi, I'm Maddie. I'm an alum from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. I was part of Filipino Student Union, and yeah, I used to also be Mafa alum board. Is that the right term?
Thanks, Maddie. Marion.
Hi, my name is Marian. I go to St. Louis University. I'm affiliated with the Filipino Student Association, and I go by she, her, hers.
Thanks, everyone. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the discussion question. So does anybody want to kick us off with one great thing that has happened to them recently, or how you have been feeling this week?
I can say something positive. Wait, isn't my mic working? Hello? Is this working? Okay, cool. All right. So I got my second exam for my nursing course, and I got an A. So I'm pretty psyched about it. Thank you.
I have something. I just moved into my first apartment on my own, and I'm working on getting back to work. So there's something.
I got something. This past week, my two little cousins graduated from high school, so that's pretty cool.
Great. Okay, so we'll move on. So next on our agenda is the community wellness check, and I'm going to hand this off to Alex and Marielle.
I cannot see the slides.
Okay. So the reason why we asked these questions is because we wanted to check in with y'all. So the recent events surrounding the Black Lives Matter movement has affected communities all throughout the world. And one example of this, which isn't shown on this slide, is the reaction of a former aide of President Barack Obama. I'm not sure if y'all heard of Desiree Barnes, and she gave a viral speech in response to the looters in her New York neighborhood that took advantage of local businesses during a large protest. If y'all are interested in watching the video, it'll be linked after the discussion. The biggest takeaway from her speech is when she says, "You don't see corporations on the street. There are human beings that live in this neighborhood." And this just shows one of the many emotions that have resulted from these events. Okay, next slide, please.
So as a part of our community wellness check, we want to place an emphasis on mental health and give y'all a tool to potentially help improve mental health, both in specific situations and just over time. And so I'm going to be introducing and leading y'all through a small little exercise in box breathing. Now, box breathing is a breathing method developed by the Navy SEALs to both improve concentration and reduce stress. As you can see from the graphic, the overall way that it works is you take a nice long breath inwards for 4 seconds, keep breathing air in, you hold that breath in for 4 seconds, you breathe that out, really trying to like flatten out your lungs, get it all out for the next 4 seconds, and then just have your lungs stay empty for 4 seconds before repeating the process. All of this being done with breathing through the nose, not in the mouth. So, and then I want to do this right now just to kind of get everyone in a good headspace before diving into some of these heavier conversations. And this is also something that y'all could use potentially like during the conversation, even afterwards in the coming days if you're ever feeling stressed. So everyone try and get comfy in your seats. We're going to do this for about 5 minutes so that it can really like set in and we can really get mentally prepared. So I will lead us through the first couple cycles. Just breathe in, hold, and breathe out in accordance to my voice. And then after a couple cycles, I'll stop speaking and we can just keep going at that pace. Make sure to really fill up the lungs, really deflate the lungs, take it nice and slow. So if everyone's ready, you're going to breathe in for 4 seconds. Hold. Breathe out. Hold. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Hold. Breathe in. Hold. Breathe out. Hold. In. Hold. Out. Hold. Keep going in that
So Alex,
pace.
we're actually going a little bit over schedule right now. So
okay,
can we move on to the next slide?
For sure. So yeah, keep that technique in mind, y'all. Use it in your day-to-day whenever you need, but hope you learn something new.
Okay. Thanks, Alex, for leading us through that breathing exercise. One last thing before we begin our roundtable discussion, we would like to remind you all to be aware of the privileged identities you may hold And remember to create space so that others may feel comfortable to share. Hence the phrase take space, make space. So please keep this in mind during this discussion.
Thanks, Marielle. So next on our agenda is discussing dismantling anti-blackness and racism. So I'm gonna hand the mic off over to Jason, JJ, and Jay.
Hey everyone, so we'll be doing the dismantling anti-blackness and racism. We'll be discussing 3 different topics: colorism and racism, anti-blackness history, colorism, and me. In our first topic, we'll be going over definitions, what these terms mean, going over some examples. In the second topic, we'll be going over what is anti-blackness and the history behind it, and how did others overcome the challenges of their own biases. And then the third topic, we'll be discussing colorism and me, tying it all together, applying what we've learned in our own lives, and looking at the intersectionality and humanism of it. With that, we'll go into the next slide, and Jason will start us off. Jason, you're muted.
Yikes, my bad, guys. Well, hello, everyone, again. Before we start, I just want to make sure that we all understand that kind of what we mentioned earlier, the take space and make space and take space, sorry. But just make sure we take the time to like really think about what we're saying and make sure that we're taking account for what other people are feeling. Because these are some really heavy topics. Starting the very first question we're starting right now is, how have I been racist or colorist? That's a pretty heavy question on its own. So I think it's better we start to talk about it at smaller scales. So for instance, let's start off with, what is racism? So what is racism to you guys? Like, how have you experienced racism? What is racism to you? Anybody wanna? Any answer is okay. There's no wrong answers here. Yes, Alex?
For myself, a lot growing up, especially because I came from a very small, predominantly white rural town of Wisconsin. Whenever I do well on academics or anything, they'd always just be like, "Oh, he's Asian. Like, of course he did well. Oh, he's Asian, so of course, like." And so it was never like me trying hard or me like putting in a lot of work to try and do well. It's always just because I'm Asian that I get into great.
And just want to chime in, and I don't think you guys need to be moderated. So if you want to just unmute yourself at any time and just answer, discuss. One thing I do want to add, Alex, is I'm also from a predominantly white community. It's a small town in Wisconsin, or northeast Wisconsin, and it was different for me because like nobody had ever heard of a Filipino. They're like, what is a Filipino? And it's hard to describe because like if I tell people that I'm Asian, it's like, well, you don't look Asian, right? And they just think I like automatically like Hispanic or Mexican or Spanish or something like that. So it was definitely kind of difficult to like introduce myself as like a Filipino and really like own my own identity.
Just to kind of keep things rolling. The next question on that axis is what makes you a member of your race? Of course, there's physical qualities about us that makes us different from each other, but I want us to think a little more in depth, I guess. So what makes you a member of your race? When you look at other people and when people look at you, what makes you different from other people besides the physical things between us?
I think it's with the family aspect, because I know within Filipino culture, we're very, we take care of our own. For example, having like 3 generations all living in one household. When I would talk about that with my other friends of like, for example, like my white friends, they'd be like kind of confused, like, don't you put your parents in like a nursing home? But I said like, no, it's kind of not kind of the thing to do in our culture. So that's one way.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I think to generalize that point even more is like having shared cultures and shared experiences kind of what helps you identify yourself within a certain race. And I actually wanted to answer the last question just a little bit, like speaking to the individual experiences that Alex and Cedric had. Like through those individual experiences, you can kind of see how like whiteness is seen as the default, because they say like, oh, I've never seen an Asian person, or I've never seen a Filipino person before. And so like seeing it on more of like a systemic level, that it's like you're a part of certain institutions that already see white people as a default and think of other races or people of other colors as something different, or at a lot of times less than.
Yeah, can I add on to what Rafi said? That's for example, like in backing to like the first question, my personal experience was I was coming out of church, and this white middle-aged man passes me and my sisters, and he goes ni hao, and he walks away. But like I whipped around and turned, I was like, hello, excuse me, because and the justification that he said was because I have Asian friends is why he's allowed to say that. So I don't think that's right. So having like that by default, all of a sudden people think like, oh, because I have, you know, this friend, like these kind of friends, like I have like an open door. Like that isn't the case. And so yeah, I got really heated, but you know, I kept my cool. But I tried educating the man, like, hey, you know, that's not polite to say. Even if you have Asian friends, it's not acceptable. There should be some level of respect here. And it also was kind of sad because, you know, I'm like over here like 22, and then he's over there probably like 40 or like 50. Yeah.
Okay. Would anybody else like to add on before we continue?
I'd like to. Go ahead.
I was like, I'd like to add on to that. I go to a predominantly white school, and like, I feel like racism comes in different forms, especially for like microaggressions. It's not recognized as much, or even like systematic racism. Like, it's interesting to see like I'm supposed to look up to my own professors, yet they make commentary, whether it's like cultural bias, microaggression, or just like straight out like commentary. And like it's interesting how like these things aren't really talked about, and like we have to correct the people even if it's like our own professors. Like that's something that I did as well, like standing up to my own friend's microaggression experience.
Okay. JJ, did you want to add on?
Yeah, just like looking at my like experience from like school, going to like a public school and middle school, there was not a lot of Filipinos in my area for that schooling building, and finding like a group of people that wasn't Filipino but like being claimed by Hispanics, or having a lot of Black friends and being claimed by them as a person of color. I think that like transcends past race or ethnicity. And then going to a white school in high school, just seeing even more less BIPOC people, and just like experiencing like different stereotypes and different prejudices towards like myself and others. Just yeah, I don't know. Like
okay. I'm sorry. Were you continuing stuff?
I just wanted to bring that up too.
Okay. Well, just to keep things on the track still, thank you everybody for contributing. So back to the main question above, like how have I been racist or colorist? I think before we continue on to that point, I think there's some things we should understand too. One of the biggest things we should understand is that racism, as mentioned earlier, is a form of systematic and systemic oppression, which basically means that racism comes in many different parts. Sorry, can you go to the next slide? So when we look at racism, it's important that we look at the different aspects of racism and how these different aspects affect us and different parts of our social and just our reality in general. Just real briefly, has anybody ever heard of these words before? Has anyone heard of the word colorism or racial purity or explicit racism or any of these words right here before we go over them real fast?
I've actually never heard of colorism until this this roundtable.
Okay. Well, I'm gonna go ahead and continue on then. Sorry. Sorry, can you go back to the first slide? Sorry. All right, yeah, sorry. So just real briefly then. So for people who aren't used to these terms or aren't used to what these terms exactly mean, colorism is pretty plain forward with its description right there. It's just discrimination based on skin tone. Our racism, though, is just discrimination based on our racial characteristics. I think it's important right now that we mention that people of the same race might have different skin tones, and people of different races might have similar skin tones. With that in mind, why do you guys think that that distinction between colorism and racism exists? Why do you think that distinction might exist? Do you think there's an importance that the distinction exists? Do you think it might be useful for us to know the distinction, or what do you guys think about that distinction?
I think it's important. Actually, I didn't know the term, but colorism is kind of a big topic in the Filipino culture. I think because in Filipino culture, people don't like being darker; they prefer being a lighter skin. So I think that there is a distinction between colorism and racism that is important.
Yeah, I feel like.
Sorry, continue. You can go ahead.
I was just gonna say, especially like for people like myself who are say like half, or just even people who are full who end up being a lot lighter to the point where they're almost white passing, then they may not face much discrimination just based on skin tone, because people may even perceive them as being white, even though racially they're not.
Okay. So just adding a little bit on about colorism. Generally, it's understood that colorism tends to be more so a byproduct of racism. So while they're different, they're still connected in that kind of way. And it's also generally understood, so kind of add on what you guys were saying too, countries that have long struggled with colonization and, for example, the United States or even the Philippines, also happen to have a long history of colorism too. Also in these societies, racial purity, the belief that races are on the hierarchy scale, and you need to preserve this hierarchy scale in kind of a way. These type of beliefs also originate from these types of societies too. So with that in mind, I wanted to go to the explicit and implicit racism, because we mentioned that earlier too, and I think those are some pretty important things to understand too. So just real simple and plain, explicit racism is just over it. It's what you think of when you think of racism. It's the clearly wrong, this is completely not right, this should not be happening right now. While the implicit racism is more so what the unconscious thoughts and the unconscious things you do. With that in mind, aversive racism and internalized racism are in a way kind of one step from that. Before I continue, is there any questions? Cool. Is everyone doing okay? It's kind of a lot of information at once, and they are heavy topics. And I just want to make sure we're doing okay before we continue. Can I just get like a thumbs up or something just to make sure we're good? All right, cool. So just real fast about aversive racism and internalized racism. Aversive racism, well, let's take one step back. So when you think about implicit racism is more so about all the unconscious things you think about, all that you do not think about, but still affect you on your daily basis. So when you think about aversive racism, someone who is aversely racist is somebody who consciously is presenting aspects of a positive mindset. So they're like denying that they're racist, or they're denying that they're sexist or colorist or whatever we're talking about at the moment. They're denying these things, and they're also promoting these things too. So they're promoting segregation. They're promoting people to get together, promoting people to work together. These are the type of things that an adverse racist would do, while all at the same time holding unconscious negative thoughts about people of other beliefs and races. That's lots to put a lot at once, but and the most basic way to think about it is that aversive racism is people who are considered aversive racists are people who worry a lot about their self-image. And in psychology, there's something called cognitive dissonance. So when these people promote these positive social interactions, but still hold these negative interactions inside. The disconnection that's happening right there is them trying to preserve their self-image. This is kind of on the complete opposite scale of internalized racism. While aversive racism cannot deal with what's dealing inside right now at the moment, internalized racism is more so about what we, as people who are targeted by racism, take away from that targeting. And another way is more so, you can think of it like people who are under pressure by racist oppression or by society that places that kind of oppression on them will sometimes kind of just accept, and they refuse to stop fighting and just accept what it is. And then they internalize that racism inside. This happens a lot to a lot of people who were colonized or subjugated, including African Americans in the United States and people of Algeria and people of India and people of the Philippines too. Any questions?
I've got one just to kind of like clarify. So is aversive racism kind of like how before Trump, a lot of people like that you wouldn't think of as you didn't know as racist, and when Trump's like came into became very public and was very like outwardly racist, and suddenly all these people seem to like racists seem to be coming out of the cracks because it seemed more socially acceptable. That kind of going from like aversive racism to more explicit.
I think that's definitely one way to look at it. Obviously, I'm not an expert on any of these things in the way. I'm just one person that experiencing them too. So I can't make the claim, but that would make sense. And that does make sense to me too. The big thing about aversive racism is the idea about yourself. You're more so worried about how you appear to other people. So like your social setting. So aversive racist people can have Black friends. That's like the whole problem with that saying too, you know? So like, I can't be racist, or I can't be racist. I have Black or Asian friends. Even if they have that, it's just like that discognation right there, that happening right there, the dissociation that's happening right there. You kind of get what I'm saying?
Yeah, it was like that story Jolene said earlier, of like the guy trying to say, "Oh, I have Asian friends, so I can."
Yeah. Yeah, that was actually a perfect example of it too. All right, cool. So one last question, then we'll answer the main question. So how do you guys think these kind of mindsets arise? Like, what do you think is happening on the mental level for these things to type of arise, these type of mindsets? I'm particularly referring to aversive racism and internalized racism.
I think internalized racism is a really good place to start when we talk about how these things arise, like how we think, like that in itself is we're internalizing the things that have been considered the mainstream or considered the standard for how we should think about things, especially when it comes to like ourselves as political identities. And so like if you think about like how anti-blackness even came to be in our country, and it all has to do with the way slaves were treated after emancipation and how the laws consistently upheld this idea that Black people had to be subjugated and other people of color by extension had to be subjugated as well. And so by institutionalizing the idea of people of color and Black people and Indigenous people are less than, then that in turn leads these communities themselves to internalize those racist ideas as well. And then it becomes aversive because it's part of the mainstream and it's part of the policies that we live by. It's part of the things that we perpetuate on a daily basis when we participate in anything that was built on these policies.
Okay. I like how you said how you mentioned about like these ideas being held by Black people too, because going back to the definition for racism, it's about that perceived status of your race. That's more so the big thing. It's not more so about the physical qualities, but more so the perceived status and the beliefs and the ideas that surround the race too. So I like that. That really adds on to that too. So that makes sense too. So we can just go backwards one moment to the previous slide to go to the first question. So have I been racist or colorist? So now that we understand all these different types of definitions, all these different meanings and words, and we understand what racism is and colorism is a little better, to a clean distinction anyway, would anybody feel like sharing? I can start two of you, like, so.
Well, like, Okay, there's echo. So with the whole colors thing, it's like growing up, I grew up with a predominantly like white area neighborhood. And for myself, I noticed that I was treated differently because I was more fair skin toned Black person. And my friends who were more darker were were talked about like more like it's like animals. Like I've heard like many people say like they were gorillas or they looked like monkeys and like these kind of racist, colorist characteristics. And like it made me like sit back to think of myself of like we're both and it would even be like Black people saying these words too. Like people who were like lighter skin toned Black people were saying these words too. And it made me like question like why as a fair skinned golden brown person I'm more accepted than the more darker skin tone Black person in the media and like in media. Like if you like watch like any Black shows, like most of the Black leads are like very like lighter skin, like, and if they are darker skin they're conceived as like ghetto or drug dealers or like over sexualized and like that kind of mindset, and something that like has been going on for years.
To add on to what like Cavante was saying, just like how it's been going on for years, I think it just shows like the generational trauma that continues to happen with this subject, since every time it's brought up, it feels like no one really tries to dig deeper into like why race and colorism really affects our day-to-day thinking. And even I will admit, like, because of things that are like adversely and like internalized from like racism, when you're in like crowds or you don't feel familiar, it like inherently feel like, am I being like racist or colorist for thinking this way? But when I was with my sister and being able to kind of talk about and be open about how you can be uncomfortable in those spaces, I think it opens up for discussion to like be more open to what those different spaces can lead to. And I think once you have that mindset that a different color or race isn't scary, it's just like what the media or like different portrayals of them have, you kind of, you don't like dismantle the racism, colorism that continues to happen, but you just have a more open mind and continue to advocate for those people.
I think that's very true, and I like where you headed that one too. I think I do think like the way society is structured and the way we have been kind of rolled over, the idea in the process of developing the colorist like thoughts or even like, so for instance, like implicit racial bias, right? I think it's fair to think that everyone has some form of implicit racial bias, either from how we were raised or the people we grew up around or how we were taught. I think it's fair to say that all these things kind of like influences all the time, just because like it's just how the structure is. Because once again, it's systematic and it's systemic. I think once we start looking a little more at the history too, that kind of like will expose to us. We can see a little more of that too. All right, cool. So, what is the history? I think it's important to point out too that when speaking about history and we talk about these people who lived in the past, where it be during the early 1700s or the 1800s or even during like the civil rights movement, even these people who aren't alive now, I think it's important to know that these people and their efforts still matter to this day because we are in the way literally walking in their footsteps, and we're literally living in the dreams that they had pushed for and strived for and believed in, you know? I think those things are pretty important. So that's why I think it's important we talk about history, especially when we start talking about anti-blackness and what anti-blackness means. Have anyone ever heard the term anti-blackness before? Hold on a second. Can you guys think of some examples of anti-blackness?
Maybe one example would be like in kind of interaction. Like if you're in an elevator, if there's an anti-black interaction, somebody might perceive somebody as scary or intimidating, and like maybe pull their purse or like make sure where their stuff is, right? Like I think that's one example of being anti-black.
Okay.
I guess another example. Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead.
Well, I guess just here in Wisconsin, you know, there's a neighborhood that's supposed to be technically the higher end called the Third Ward, and it is mostly populated by like a lot of like rich white people. And whenever there is like a black person or a black family that walks around, because it's also a tourism spot, they get, you know, a lot of weird looks, and especially when someone's like walking down the street and passes like a family, I'll notice the family like same thing like Cedric said, grab their purse or like grab their kid closer to them or something and hold their hands.
Well, those are all good answers and they're all true. Just putting out like a basic definition for it. Anti-blackness is a form of racism that usually can be thought pertaining specifically to only Black people in the United States, but can also be expanded to the entire African diaspora. So anti-blackness occurs worldwide too. Anti-blackness is thought of being rooted in the enslavement of Africans, but it still persists to this day. Can you think of examples of how it persists to this day?
Over-policing of Black communities.
Yeah, I mean, like, they're not like, unfortunately, they're not like hard to think of, you know, in the way today's settings are and stuff too. So before I start going a little bit more of the history, I want to know, what do we know about Black history, and what do we know about the history of anti-Blackness in the United States? Like, what did you learn in school or outside school? Like, what were you raised with, you know?
I think that's an interesting question, because I think everything is rooted in the education of students. And in my particular case, for example, especially a recent example, I didn't find out about or really learn in depth what Juneteenth was until recently, until after high school, right? Another example is like, we talk about civil rights movement, but it's like a movie to us. Like, oh, Martin Luther King Jr. did this and he was cool, and then he died. Oh, Malcolm X was also in there. He was there was like something going on with that, and stuff like that. So I think it's like that education is like kind of like keeping us at that like bliss of like ignorance.
Okay. Anybody else would like to add on to, or any other thing?
I think on top of the education, there's also like the treatment of like Black history in the U.S. This sort of like idea that, you know, after the civil rights movements, everything was perfect. There's no other racism after that, and that keeps on being like, you know, sort of subliminally, you know, taught to us that there's no racism in the U.S. There's no, you know, every system that we create isn't racist. The government isn't racist. Nobody's racist anymore. Racism doesn't exist.
Going off of the whole education thing is like, as Americans, when we are taught about like Black history, we're only told of the American aspect of it. We don't learn about the other cultures that have African Americans, Africans and Blacks around the world, and we don't learn about their struggles and their trials and tribulations that they have accomplished. And that's something to think about too.
Also, how just historically there are a lot of laws that specifically targeted Black people, like laws to prevent Black people from marrying white people and such.
Yeah, going off of that, I think we also learn about like amendments and how like slavery was abolished, but no one ever applies it to how it applies to modern day, especially with the clause in the 13th Amendment about how prisoners can still be subject to slavery. And we also it also goes into like human sex trafficking, and like just overall, we don't talk about modern day slavery. We only talk about how we supposedly ended it a long time ago.
Also, going off of that, slavery still exists in other countries as well. And the idea that we're not talking about slavery not existing in other countries is kind of scary to me.
Anybody else would like to add on?
Jason, I just want to say we have around 5 minutes left for this topic.
Okay. All right, cool. Well, and now with that in mind, let me go ahead and continue on about anti-blackness there real fast. So when you guys think about history and you think about these things in mind, let's think about why anti-blackness still persists on to each generation, even if slavery ended so long ago. I like to start off with, I'm not gonna go through like the whole history of Black history, but I would like to just start off a little bit more talking about what happened particularly after the Civil Rights Movement, because that's where we tend to just leave off on the history books. So 1964, the Civil Rights Act was passed, and in 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated. Like I mentioned earlier, the history lists of us. My grandfather was only 18 years old when Martin Luther King died. Have you guys ever heard of the war on drugs?
Yes.
So you guys are pretty hip. So you guys know how bad that was and how much damage that did to Black and brown communities across the United States. The crazy thing about at the moment, though, is that people heard war on drugs and people were usually happy about it because they had this image in mind of these drugs and these communities and these type of people bringing it in. Just going back to, again, speaking about what that status is on the racial term, when we talk about racism and colorism. Nixon declared drugs to be the enemy number one of the United States. When Nixon was impeached, that was 46 years ago. How many people do you know who are 50 or 46, you know? Ronald Reagan will go on to pass the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1968, which allowed around $1.7 billion to be allocated to the war on drugs. Meanwhile, sorry, 1 second. Meanwhile, have you guys ever heard of the CIA Contra? No? Okay. So after the war on drugs was declared, that after Ronald Reagan had passed his bill to increase the money for this bill, in 1996, it comes out that literally 1 year after this bill was announced, the CIA had flooded the Black community with crack and cocaine. This is 1 year after Ronald Reagan had passed his bill to increase the money to fight against the war on drugs. I want to also point out too that one of the interesting things about a lot of the bills put in place for the war on drugs is that they were distinctly made to harm the African American community, particularly harsher. 80% of crack users were African American. And even though crack and cocaine are both the same exact thing chemically, and usually go for the same amount of stuff too, crack was, for the sentence for crack was 5 grams for crack is 5 years. To get that same sentence with cocaine, you need 500 grams. Cocaine was more prosperous in white neighborhoods. I think like these things are mentioned in the notes because when we talk about like prisons and the 13th Amendment and how those things matter now, we gotta know how we got there from the beginning. So after this comes out in 1996, in 1997, the crime bill is passed. The crime bill didn't do anything major as for money or anything, but it increased all the minimum sentences for African Americans in prison. People joked around and said that kind of grimly that they took other parents and left. They took other parents from the neighborhoods and left the babies to be raised by crackheads. I think things we need to understand and notice is that from 1980, 2 years after Nixon was impeached, non-violent drug offenses went up from 50,000 to 400,000 by 1997. In 2003, the Bureau of Justice Statistics reported that 1 in 3 Black men will be incarcerated at some point in life if the rates of incarceration in 2001 kept up going. When we talk about anti-Blackness and we talk about what it means to us and what it means today, it's important to understand that we never started from nowhere. Like when we speak about colonization, we talk about slavery, we talk about the Civil Rights Movement, everything happens in a succession. So we got here from somewhere, I have to say at the end of the day. So with this in mind, how do you guys think these, when now that you guys know these things, how do you guys feel or think about protests like Black Lives Matter or, well, yeah, Black Lives Matter? How do you feel about the protests and what they're trying to do now that you guys know these things?
I think I've felt like it's just been like kicking the same can for too long. Like these problems have existed, and like the Black Lives Matter movement isn't new, but now it's really in the spotlight right now. And like I'd like there to be some like not a resolution, but things just to actually change instead of just kick the can further. Oh, we'll do something and then bide the people until the next movement comes up again, right? I think this should be the turning point.
I think something that definitely needs to happen is for people who are activists pushing for, more things to be fixed, is for more bigger permanent sort of resolutions rather than small fixes, right? So like we see it a lot like lately, like, oh, let's give Black people a holiday, that'll fix things, or let's get rid of Aunt Jemima on the bottles, and these very like small little like band-aid fixes over really looking at the problem and the issue behind things.
Kind of adding on to that, it's good to see those kind of incremental changes, but it's like you have to think a bit like, what's the 10x? Like, what's this? How do you scale this? Like, how can it become bigger? And how can those incremental changes kind of snowball into something like solid, something that's actually meaningful?
I'm gonna just I think it starts with, or I think the thing we should do is, somebody mentioned education, is we're really, really focused on telling racists right now to be anti-racist, but the easier way to go is to not teach racism in itself. So that's focusing kind of like, you guys are Gen X or Gen Zs. So kind of focusing on that and then teaching the next generation to not be racist or that same hate. And that's where we kind of cut it off, because we have those small instances of racism that's not kind of like shown. Like for me, at least, I know that my grandma told me, hey, when I first came to America, she was like, hey, we live in Carson, Compton's right next door. Don't have your stuff next to you because, a Black man might steal it. And so those small things kind of snowball into something bigger, where I know for a fact that at one point in my life, and I'm 27 years old, and I've been problematic. I know I've had a problematic stage where I didn't notice that the things I was saying was just horrible. And so I think it starts there. It starts off of just cutting it and kind of saying, hey, we need to end this. And that's through education.
I definitely think that it does like begin at an individual level too, like how you were speaking of. For instance, when I was doing research for this, when I learned about the CIA contract, I never knew about this ever happening before, honestly. And then I was even more surprised to find out that there was a movie made after this too, like movie made about this, featuring the guy from the Avengers, Hawkeye. And Hawkeye is in there, and but people don't know about this. There's clearly some kind of like separation or something happening there, Would anybody else like to add on before we continue?
I want to add on. Oh, so go ahead.
No, you go ahead. I've talked.
Going on to education, I think this movement also opens eyes to like how the American system values capitalism and militarism rather than prioritizing education, especially like for low-income communities versus like a predominantly white school. Like there's more investment into like clubs, resources, mentors into predominantly white schools versus in Black and brown community or Black and brown like schools. Like we have to like trace of like, where's our funding really going to and who are they prioritizing?
Yeah, and that really goes into like how now that you've had the, like, let's say people have the education, they invest in the education to really educate our communities about the things that our country really prioritizes. and how we interact with people who aren't white, and how we teach the history of people who aren't white. Then going beyond that, it's looking at the efforts that are being taken now by all the many activist groups around our country. So like your local Black Lives Matter organization, or the Chicago, like the bail bond funds that are in your communities. But look at all the different organizations that already have been doing work for years, trying to dismantle the systems that already oppress us. I think that's a really great way to support the movements that are going on top of education, because it really happens, the change really happens at every level, on the individual level all the way up to institution.
Absolutely. I believe. What anybody else like to add on? All right. We're talking a lot about activism and what needs to be happening and what we need to do to change the way things are. I want to ask real fast, what is it, when we're talking about being an ally, is it being anti-racist that makes you an ally, or is it being an activist that makes you an ally? What are you guys' thoughts and opinions on that?
I think it's both. I think you have to be anti-racist to have that sort of passion and that want for things to change. I mean, you can't just be not racist. You have to be anti-racist, and you have to have that accountability, that call to action, that understanding that, hey, I see it now. What can I do to help? What can I do that, Native Americans have the saying about 7 generations. What can I do that can kind of snowball from the 7 generations forward? Like, what am I doing now that can change this? And I think people tend to think that, being anti-racist is enough, but it's not. It means standing your ground and not teetering and not saying anything. Because the longer that you stand there and you don't say anything, or you don't do anything, you become the problem.
Going off of that, so growing up, my dad had this saying, know what you're saying and know why you're saying it. So it's one thing to be like an activist and to promote Black Lives Matter and Juneteenth, and then 1 second later you're just quiet about the movement. So know why you're being an activist, know why you're promoting for Black lives and for other people of color. Like, stand your ground on what that means for you, because it's like Rachel said, it's more than just being non-racist. It's all about the system.
True. I think those are very good answers, and I agree with both of you guys too. I think when we think about anti-racist and activism and what it means to be an ally, I think what Rachel said was very true, that in order to be, you have to be both. And I think the best way to think about that too is that the reason why we do both is because at the end of the day, this stuff all affects everybody, There's no, anti-blackness does not happen alone, because this isn't just a single issue struggle, I think this is I think we can't approach racism or white supremacy or whatever is directly in front of you as a single issue struggle, because they have more than one issue correlated to, Obviously, anti-blackness doesn't affect me. It affects you guys too. It affects everybody in the United States who isn't fitting the standard of what it means to be, Anybody else like
Jason, I think that's a good place to wrap up in this topic. I know you have a few more slides. Did you want to touch on it very quickly, or can we move on to the next facilitator?
Can we just go to the next, not the next slide, but the slide after that? Before I part off with you guys, I just want you guys to just read this quote right here and just give it a moment. We didn't get to talk about a lot of things, and it's probably because we just discussed a lot of things and we just didn't have time. One thing I want for us to really get to that we didn't really get to speak about was something called intersectionality. And I also want to talk about humanism. Andre Lorde, she's an activist. She also is somebody who really believed in intersectionality because she belonged to two separate communities. She belonged to the African American community, but she also belonged to the LGBTQ community. So for her, she got to see how both of those different types of interactions, and both of those realities intersected each other. Can you go to the next slide? These are just some people who all had to approach racism in some kind of way and all had to deal with it in some kind of way. We know some of them, obviously. We don't know some of them. Obviously, we all know Albert Einstein. What many people don't know about Albert Einstein was that when he was a younger man, he used to hold a lot of very anti-Asian American beliefs. And he used to write about these things in his diaries. It wasn't later on to his life after he had invaded Germany and came to the United States that he realized the wrongs of his way. And his way of dealing about that for him personally was to give his first 3 lectures all HBCUs in the United States. Corporal David Fagan, I hope I'm saying his last name correctly. He was a soldier during the Filipino American War. He was an African American. He saw what we were doing to Filipinos and he didn't believe it. He was anti-against it, so he deserted the U.S. Army and joined them. Muhammad Ali was he was a boxer. Obviously, he's a very famous boxer. He's one of the greatest of all time, obviously. But he too also had to deal with these different intersections of his life because he was a boxer and he was an icon, but he was also a Black man. And at the time too, the Vietnam War was going on. Elizabeth Woods was United Farm Workers, for instance. The United Farm Workers were a labor union that was predominantly made up of Filipino Americans and Chicano Americans in Southern California. For them, the civil rights movement mostly focused on anti-blackness, but for them, they saw a lot of what was happening to Black people over in the South to them in Southern California. So I'm going to wrap up right now, but I just want you guys to think about how everyone is different and how everyone has their own agency. You know, we're all human, we're all dynamic. We all have our own reality, you know? I think the biggest thing to understand about racism is that racism affects all of us because all of our realities intersect in some kind of way, in one part or another, you know? That's the end.
Thanks, Jason. It was great hearing from you and learning from you. So next on our agenda is how to have conversations with family and friends, and I'm going to hand it off to Rafi.
All right, so actually before we really get into talking about how to have conversations with your family and friends, I actually want to take it back to something that our JJ and Jason talked about, and that's having your own personal experiences with biases and racism, whether that's you witnessing it or you even being the person who's committing those, acting on your biases and racism. And what I really want us all to kind of discuss, this portion is going to be a lot more discussion based. I want to hear from everyone and I want to hear how you all feel because, you know, I'm sure a lot of you have had conversations with your family and friends about this stuff. But yeah, so the things that I want you to think about when we discuss our experiences with biases and racism is how we felt about it and how we dealt with it. I know I and Jolene talked about it a little bit earlier when that man came up to you and said oh, ni hao. So yeah, if anyone wants to get the conversation started on your personal experiences.
Yeah, actually kind of similar to Jolene's story, being darker skinned, and for some reason this happens a lot in bathrooms, at airports. But when I'm there, washing my hands, somebody might come up to the sink next to me and start speaking Spanish. And I don't know Spanish, but I mean there are similarities within Tagalog, which is a Filipino language, and Spanish. But I'd usually just say, "Oh, your Spanish is really good. I don't speak Spanish because I'm Filipino." But it's just those kind of awkward experiences, "Oh, he's brown, he must be Mexican, Spanish," things like that.
Yeah. Oh, one thing actually before you keep talking, I do want to mention that something that could come up is why do we talk about ourselves when in a movement like Black Lives Matter, we should be centering Black voices, Black leaders, and all that stuff. And it's something that for a lot of our communities that just sometimes people have trouble connecting themselves or they have trouble empathizing when they feel like they don't feel connected, and that's something we might talk about a little bit later. But yeah, we can. Okay, just disclaimer before we get back to discussion. But yeah, yeah, let's keep going with this. How do you react to those types of interactions, and how do you feel? When do you react to those things as well? Whether it's like something that feels more hateful, or maybe it's something that you just like a microaggressive comment in passing.
So I work at a restaurant, and we in downtown Detroit, and we get like a lot of very upscale white businessmen and their wives and things like that. And there are times like where like we like hear subtle things like I'll be wiping a table off and I'll hear like the couple on the table like, oh, would you like to come home and like help us clean out our houses too, you know, like, and they'll like laugh about it, like it's like a joke of like the subtle things. And for me, like it's like I'll give them like I don't understand look, like I don't know what you mean, because like I don't get the joke, because the joke isn't funny for me as a person of color whose entire history is based on housework and slavery and those microaggressions. And like I'll like hear like the last time I was at work, it was like I had worked a party, and it was like a work party, and there was one Asian female there, and they were reading like the menu that we had set up for them, and I had overheard like one of like these like other women like say like, oh, like they had pointed her out. It was like, maybe we should get you like some like, it was like some, I forgot exactly what she said. It was like some stereotype like Asian person, like what they like stereotype like what they eat, and like it's just like some of things like that. And like it made me feel like uncomfortable and like uneasy, because like I have a lot of Asian American friends, and I want to dwell myself in learning more about your guys' culture as well as my own culture.
Thank you for sharing. Would anyone else like to share? Maybe we could get 2 more people to just share on their experiences with bias or racism.
Am I still on? I can say another one. In school, I don't know what happened was like so I came into class and I sat down, and then there's a one Asian professor in our entire building, and so a lot of them were just like, oh, I just saw your mom walk by, and I'm just like, I'm not related to her. I mean, like, and everyone laughed, so I didn't know really how to react other than to like laugh with them, because it was early in the morning, and there was like I had a rough morning. It's just I didn't want to like say anything, but that was like a really tough situation. Like I didn't know what to do because everyone was laughing, and I was kind of just confused. Like this, and I also experienced that too in high school, and it was very like kind of like annoying.
Thank you for sharing again.
I'd like to talk about how my school tokenizes diversity and inclusivity. We actually had a protest. It was actually a Black Lives Matter movement. It's a similar situation just on my campus, but our own president of my school didn't prioritize taking care of our students or even amplifying their voices. He tried to like keep silent about it until we had a protest. And now it's like that situation where he'd even prioritize his students. He's now putting out a solidarity statement about the current situation. And it's like, I don't know, I feel like you just kind of like tokenized our own school and your students and like put a solidarity statement for performative allyship.
Yeah. Thank you, Anna. So the reason that I had everyone like share these things again is because some of the feelings that come up are like, I was uncomfortable. That was a tough situation. I don't have the energy to deal with that, and that's totally real things that we experience when we experience racism and biases from people who don't look like us. And by talking about these things, it helps us kind of understand our own biases, and it helps us understand empathize with the discrimination that Black folks face every day. And I mean to say, like, we are POC, right? But the experiences we face as Asian Americans maybe are not on the same level. Like for instance, our experiences as children of immigrants or refugees does not equate the generational trauma of slavery, but we can recognize that there's a shared experience of being oppressed by the same people. So, like, by talking about this, we kind of can air that out. We can understand and see it out in the open that these are things that we all confront every day. And further, that those are conversations that you will end up having with your parents, especially in times like these when this stuff is all over the news and people are like, oh, well, why is this happening? Why do people have to be like this? Like, can't they just sit down and be quiet about it? Like, the government will do it. Like, there always will be counter arguments. And I'm really glad that really quickly at the end of Jason's little discussion, he talked about the the Black soldier who defected from the U.S. Army. I think that really helps us kind of find our connections, the Filipinos at least, connections that we have with the Black community and Black Americans specifically. Because it was in fact that Black Americans were vocal against American intervention in the Philippines. And so finding those connections that Black people have with the Philippines will really help us ground our conversations maybe with our families about the Black Lives Matter movement. And so I guess moving on from there, if we can go to the next slide. Have you all had conversations with your parents or your family about Black Lives Matter and racism? And more on top of that, how did they go? Like, were they civil or did you have a hard time?
Definitely a hard time for sure. My mom would even get like angry about it. I don't know. I was like I was explaining to my little sister that it's just, we don't really know how to come about to try to like just talk, because whenever we do talk about like the protests or like the movement, she would start talking about something else, or like saying that, oh, I came here with nothing and I made something out of myself. Like, why can't they do the same? Like, they would say stuff like, she would say stuff like that. And then she goes off saying like all lives matter, and like I understand, like I try to tell her like I understand, like all lives do matter. It's just, they're just different. It's like the other people are treated differently just because of the color of their skin, and I don't know, she kind of has a hard time viewing it, and we're working on it. It's just she initially gets like angry about it, which is kind of rough to kind of figure out.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a big one. And I think something I forgot to mention before from what people shared earlier is like when you do have the energy to kind of answer to those racially or those biased statements, is like recentering the conversation. Like, as Cedric said, like not throwing the other group under the bus. Like, oh, actually, I don't speak Spanish, but your Spanish is great. But I don't speak Spanish, and like not throwing the other community under the bus. So like what you did, like recentering the conversation, like your mom said all lives matter, and you're like, well, yeah, all lives do matter, but Black lives matter a lot right now, and it seems like the government's not telling us it doesn't matter. So that's a really great way to like conduct conversations with your family. Does anyone else?
I think one
share?
interesting thing is like, when you're talking to your family, especially, it's hard because like when you're talking to your mother or father, that there's like the level of respect or hierarchy within the family. Like you can't really tell your parents what's what, right? Because they are usually ones who tell you what to do or how to think. But one thing to be careful of when you're having those conversations is to help and try not to make it divisive, because as soon as it's a fight, everybody, both sides, get entrenched in their own views when it's really all about having those conversations, especially like having conversations about Black Lives Matter and racism with people who don't share the same views as you. That's how I feel like people can grow, is through conversations with others that aren't sharing the same views or aren't on the same wavelength about things.
Yeah. Thank you, Cedric. Anyone else would like to share?
I'm kind of adding on to what to the last question in a way about how like discussing with family. I actually had a little bit of difficulty with my family too as well. I think a lot of people, for me, I had gotten into it with my mother and some of my her sisters and my aunties and uncles because they didn't want me to go out protesting because they believed they didn't really agree with the idea of like protesting at the moment because they didn't believe in like because the whole thing went back to looting and went back to violent protests versus peaceful protests. And even for them too, though, it was that distinction on them because they were like, we did this already. Like, why are you guys doing this? You know? And I had to get into it with my mom a little bit and just had to explain to her, like, mom, things are kind of the same way, you know, like things haven't really changed that much, you know? And just to just kind of like talk a little bit more, like add on to what you're saying. Like.
Yeah, that's also a really great way to kind of address like the comments of looting and rioting. It's like, well, what's really important here? Is it really the looting or rioting, or is it why they're looting or rioting? Again, like recentering or refocusing on what is the reason for the movement? Why are we supporting the Black Lives movement or Black Lives Matter movement so strongly?
I think too, like, because people always ask too, like, why do they have to loot? And obviously, we don't want to encourage violence. We don't ever want to say that we should like fight and kill or do what we have to like take means by our own hands, obviously. But it's also important to just look at the history too, you know, and just think about what's happened in the past and just understand where these people are coming from too, you know, to understand like what it takes to like actually start a riot, how mad people have to be and how like they feel too, you know. So
exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Anyone want to speak on specifically what they found helpful? I know some of you have talked about like countering points in a peaceful way. For me, I guess what's really helped in like not only having this conversation once, but continuing to have this conversation with your family is like I share articles with my parents in our group chats all the time. I'm like, hey, why don't you just give this a read? Or like, there's this thread I saw on Twitter about someone talking about the history of the civil rights movement and how Martin Luther King wasn't really at the center of the movement. He was just what the United States chose as a figurehead. And like sitting down with my family and just reading it out loud together and like finding those moments, even if it's just moments, to educate ourselves together. Like I don't know everything about the Black Lives Matter movement, or I don't know everything about. I think that's important to acknowledge that we don't know everything about what other people face. We don't know everything. Like I, as an Asian American woman, don't know what it's like to be policed, like heavily in a heavily policed neighborhood. But I can sure understand it if I read the works of other people who have experienced this. And I've written for years about this stuff. And so it's like learning together with my family and like helping us having those resources to guide our conversations. Yeah. I think you can get one more if anyone else wants to share their experience with having conversations with their family.
So I wanted to share one of the comments from the live chat from Edmund. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say her last name. Booney or Booney?
Booney, yeah.
Booney. He said that I think finding common experiences from the Philippines is useful. Understanding the situation of the war on drugs and PNP in the Philippines is very similar to the criminalization of Black people.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's really big. I'm glad they brought that up. Like, as I was saying before, finding the connections between the Philippines and the Black American experience or the general American experience, but mostly the Black American experience, is state-sanctioned violence. Like that's a big thing, and in the Philippines, they're on the verge of being in martial law again. I think to bring that back to our Filipino community, like with this new anti-terror bill, the Philippines is experiencing quite nearly the same things as Black people in the United States. So yeah, seeing those connections in with Filipinos in the Philippines and Black Americans is really important when you want to have these conversations, and just in general when you want to support, when you want to show solidarity. Yeah, I think that's all I have. Unless
Thank
I
you
think
so
there's
much,
one more
Rafi.
slide.
There is, but we kind of are running out of time.
Okay, that's fine.
Is it okay? Thanks, Rafi.
Yeah.
So next on the agenda, we're gonna take it to Amy. It's gonna be really quick. Just how to be an ally.
All right, so we know that there are a lot of like resources floating around the internet, and it's difficult to remember like where important information is, and then it can also feel overwhelming seeing so much information at the same time. So we wanted to compile this resource guide for you guys that highlights articles, videos, and posts that we've seen and thought were insightful. So the first two pages discuss how to talk with friends and family members, and we've put together a conversation guide that includes things like how to talk to parents, how to talk to people opposed to the movement, and how to refocus the conversation. And then we also put together resources to help you take action and support the Black Lives Matter movement. So there's links to petitions to sign, credible places to donate to, how to contact government officials and register to vote, as well as a few books, movies, and podcasts to check out. So our goal with this guide is to make sure that it has useful information and can help you with starting out on how to educate yourself and provide support. So after this roundtable, we will make this available to you guys and send it out to you guys.
Awesome.
Oh,
Thank
can
you,
I
Amy. And
add?
for those of you, oh,
sorry.
Go ahead.
I'm just gonna put it in the chat, and if you want to send it out through Mafa as well, I also have a resource about a specific topic such as the model minority myth and how to talk about that with your families, because that was something that Angeline brought up too, about like, oh, if we can work hard, why can't they? And that's like a really, really, really big misconception in our community. And so I'm just sharing that with everyone too in the group or in a Zoom chat.
Thank you
But
so
yeah,
much,
continue,
Rafi.
sorry.
And I think Amy can actually, we'll probably add that to the resource guide before we send it out tonight. And for those of you if you are listening on live stream, we will be posting this on our social media for everybody to be accessed. So feel free to share it within friends, family, and things like that. One thing we didn't want to do is talk at you, but really give you the reins and the information, and credible information especially, because I know there's a lot of misinformation out there, to really centralize and learn for yourself, and find a way for yourself to take action on your own terms. But with that, I'd like to thank everybody for participating tonight with this Black Lives Matter roundtable. One thing that I'd like to ask before we all leave this evening is please fill out this feedback survey. JJ's has put it in the chat right now. So it will take like maybe 2 minutes tops. We would love your feedback. It really helps us determine what things to do next, what we did well, what we did poorly. Other than that, thank you so much for your time, guys. And one more thank you again for all the facilitators for volunteering their time today to help inform us. And again, to you all for sharing your perspectives and participating in the discussion. So thank you. Jay, you can end the live stream now, but we'll stay on until everybody fills out the form. Then you guys feel free to exit after that.
Thank you so much for coming to the live stream.